Hi, this is Sean D'Souza, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation Podcast. This podcast isn't some magic trick about how to work less. Instead, it's about how to really enjoy the work that you do and to enjoy your vacation time. Hello, it's Sean, and you're listening to the 3-Month Vacation. Imagine yourself in 1962, and there are two rental car companies. You know them well. They're called Avis and Hertz. But Avis was in trouble, and so they were searching for some sort of ad campaign, something new that would reposition themselves in the minds of the consumer. Because right from the start, Hertz was the top dog. Avis was always lagging behind. But just falling behind, that's one thing. To continuously lose money, that's quite another. And Avis, or rather their ad agency, did something that nobody had ever done before. They began to accept that they were number two, that they were second place. Their slogan became, "When you're only number two, you try harder." I'm assuming not a lot changed. I mean, how much can you change in a car? It's a rental car after all, but Avis within a year went from losing $3.2 million a year to earning $1.2 million. And for the first time in more than a decade, it had been profitable. And this is the kind of scenario that we find ourselves in quite a lot. We have just stepped onto the internet. We have just started in business. And we think, well, there's already somebody in place. There's already somebody who's dominating the whole scenario. How can we get in? Why should we get in? Are we even going to be accepted? We look at all the competition out there, not just one Avis versus Hertz, but everyone out there and say, well, they've already done something. They've already got a foothold. They occupy the seat, the sofa, and probably own the room. The question that you're probably asking yourself is, why would they choose me? And how do I overcome this mental block? Just like Avis, we have to figure out that we are going to be number two. But there are many reasons why and how you can compete. Let's look at 3 that come to mind in almost every situation. The first is that your clients want a different style. The second is their usual choice is not available. And third, that they need a backup. These 3 are pretty self-explanatory, but let's go in a little detail about why each one of them is so crucial. Let's start out with the first one, which is they want a different style. Even with imposter syndrome firmly in place, we can depend on good old logic. And for this exercise, I had to go back to the early days in New Zealand. That was the period when I just got to New Zealand. I didn't know anyone, and my accent was such that when I said an A, people heard an E. The list went on. There are levels of imposter syndrome, like levels for anything else. Some people have to dig themselves out of a very deep hole. And I didn't. The hole was relatively shallow, which meant that I quickly found work, but I wasn't doing very well. I was a cartoonist back then, and not the only cartoonist in New Zealand, let alone Auckland. So there was choice A, choice B, choice C, choice D, choice E. And it wasn't even random. There were illustration agencies with all of these cartoonists and illustrators so that ad agencies and publishing houses and whoever wanted cartoons could find exactly what they wanted and in a very short time. And yet, I got work. And this is the most obvious reason of all why, even when you're second place or third place or fourth or 16th place, you can still find work. And that is because people are looking for a different style. Everyone has a different style, which is to say that if you gave 100 people the assignment to draw a picture of a whale, they all tend to execute it in a style that is their own. Even if you give them precise steps, you give them a video, you tell them, follow these steps, people can't help themselves. They create something that's different. And as an employer or someone that's looking for a freelancer, you want to be that difference. It's not a point of difference. It's not a uniqueness. It's just something different. When I just got to Auckland, I knew nobody. And correspondingly, nobody knew me. So I wasn't number 2. I was not on anybody's list. And if you knock on door after door after door, everybody nods politely and they say, oh, yes, we'll get back to you. And you know the feeling. You say, well, they're never going to get back to me. But they do. Someone eventually does get back to you. And that's how I met the owners of a very small design agency. So I got to know them quite well and they became good friends. They even came over to dinner to our place. We went over to their place. Wouldn't I be the natural choice if they wanted cartoons? Wouldn't they think of me first? Hadn't I gone from being a nobody to being first choice? As it turns out, no, that was not the case. Even when I'm the first choice, I'm not the only choice. And this concept applies to everything we do. You may go out to dinner, you may love a Japanese restaurant, but you have a second choice. And if you like jazz music, for example, you have a first choice, second choice, third choice, fourth choice, fifth choice. You don't really pick on one musician and go, oh, that's it. And when I was looking the other way, the agency owners called on option B, C, D, and possibly E. So I didn't get all the work, and that's normal. Even when there's no point of difference, and when everything like price and delivery times are somewhat similar, clients still need other options. They still need different styles. And that is the first reason why we always have to be number 2. That's why we have to be always hovering around, because clients just get sick of one style. And for no reason at all, they will choose the second style, and that's you. But that's not the only reason. The second reason is even more obvious, and that is that their usual choice is not available. One of the reasons why I started reading books on marketing wasn't because I was suddenly in love with marketing. I was happy as a cartoonist. But the problem that I was facing was that I could not relax on a holiday. And that was because I knew my competition was edging in on my territory. I was very territorial back then. So the story goes like this. We needed a holiday and we went off to Bali. How much did we need that holiday? I was pretty tired. I spent at least 3 or 4 days outdoors looking at the undersides of a thatched roof. I was so tired that I'd start a sentence and then I'd trail off. And it drove my wife Renuka crazy because I'm never at a loss for words. And it was almost like I'd forgotten to speak. My sentences were like that. Very frustrating. I was so tired and my brain was unwinding so slowly. Suffice to say that the holiday was required. When I got back to Auckland, I was well rested, but pretty annoyed. And the reason was that I'd found that I'd just lost quite a big assignment. While I was away, the client had called because they needed a cartoonist. They needed my work. And when it became clear that I was away, they just called the next option. I lost money, but I also introduced them to the competition, which is why I started to study more about marketing, because I was looking to create leverage so that I could earn even while I was away and looking at the undersides of thatched roofs. Let's not miss the point, however. The point was and is that your competition will be busy, they will have to go on holiday, there will be some problem. At some point, they will not be able to handle the work. It's in that scenario that the client is going to need a second option. Ta-da! That's where you step in. You may well be option C or D or E, or well down the alphabet. But there will always be situations where people are away at a Harley-Davidson rally or sucked up by aliens. They're bound to be unavailable. When such a situation comes up, you get the call, you get the job. Even though the imposter syndrome is sitting on your couch right alongside you, you will still have the job. And that's because the usual choice is not available. And a similar concept applies to our daily lives. You may love a restaurant, but tonight they're booked, unavailable. Perhaps someone has rented the entire place for their 125th birthday, or the chandelier fell in and the place got flooded. Whatever the reason, you're just likely to move on to option B and then progressively to C, D, and E. You'd think that being available when others are unavailable is no way to run a business, and yet it's a very solid way to get work. People are not available all the time, and if you do a good job, there's no reason why you can't share the spot at option A. No one is suggesting that you're going to dethrone the current option. No one is saying you're going to just push option A out. But all you're looking for is a foothold, and once you get that foothold, you can share the space and you have a 50-50 chance at getting the next job. We ask ourselves all the time, why would they choose me? How do I get rid of this anxiety in my head? But it's there. You can always step into someone else's place because of various reasons. And the third reason is simply a backup. People often ask me, how do I store my data, all of the information? And I'll tell you how it goes. It first goes onto my computer, which then goes onto Dropbox. And then there are 2 drives in the other house, which are then backed up to a cloud, which is Google. And yes, there's also another backup, which is an offline backup, and that's with a relative of mine. I know it sounds insane, but I'd rather be slightly paranoid about backups than just have everything crash on me or laugh while some hacker says, hey, I have all your information, and you go, sorry, I have 5 backups of this information. So we all need backups, and that is the third reason why someone is going to hire you, even though you're feeling, oh, why would they choose me? Everybody needs backups. We all do. If we're smart, we all have backups. Your client will also need a backup. And while this point sounds quite similar to the earlier one, it's slightly different because a backup is needed for all sorts of reasons. We don't know what the backup is needed for, so we just keep that number, that data on file. And that's why, if you're around, they're going to call you. So to summarize quickly, 1, they want a different style. 2, the usual person is not available. And 3rd, they need a backup. Is this going to work for you? Is this strategy going to work for you? I'm going to say no. These conditions don't work for most people. Why? Simply because you're not front and center. To be a viable option, which is option B, option C, option D, you have to first meet with the client. And 15 minutes after you've left their office, you will be forgotten. However, it's not their job to remember you. It's your job to be remembered, which is why you need to keep in touch. And sometimes this might be a call. Yes, it's pretty much like the 20th century. You pick up the phone, you call them. You can also back that up with a physical newsletter or something that you send out on a monthly or quarterly basis. It has to be something that they find useful, something they can open, someone they can speak to. What we're saying is everybody is trying to get the easy way, the simple way. We'll just send out a newsletter. We'll just send it out once a year. We'll just do the least amount of stuff because, hey, we don't want to bug them. And you have to do what others are not willing to do. What C and B and D and E or J or whatever is not willing to do. Because all of these things also require a lot of energy and a lot of self-talk and looking in the mirror. Because when you show up in person, you're almost guaranteed to fail because the client is not usually ready to give you work when you want the work. However, the more you show up, the more familiar they are with you, even if they say, "We'll call you." You'll be surprised at how many times they might say, "We'll call you," and then they'll call within 24 hours of you showing up. People are always impressed by others who are persistent. They're impressed when you show up despite them saying no the whole time. And it shows a hunger. And let's say that your work is already reasonably good. It doesn't have to be excellent. That hunger, that persistence will place you front and center. That will get you to the top of their list. Sooner or later, and sometimes sooner and sometimes later, the client will call you just because you showed up, or just because of that physical newsletter or calendar which showed up on a quarterly basis. They can't find your number or website when they need it. In our own lives, we have a similar experience. We see something that we like, and then we want to buy the product or the service, and we can't find it. That's because the service provider didn't bother to stay front and center. If you have an imposter syndrome, and we all do, no matter how good you are, the logical aspect of getting work is still going to remain. You have to show up on a regular basis. Without showing up, almost nothing happens, and then the imposter syndrome gets worse all the time. Your competition is likely to be sitting at home too. They're likely to have an imposter syndrome too. It's when you show up and you get in the client's face, that's when they remember you. And sometimes they don't even have the work for you and they generate it. They find a way to give you work. This strategy of persistence and showing up has a very high failure rate, but it also has the best success rate of all. And I'll tell you a personal story. I may sound really confident right now, but I've had imposter syndrome in many shapes and forms throughout my life. At first, I didn't know any better. When I started cartooning in India, it was just a way of earning extra money. It didn't bother me that much. If people said no, that was fine. I was in university, it was just pocket money. However, when the stakes went up, so did my fears. When I jumped into a new field, that's when I was the most uneasy, even if it was just a hobby. When I started to take pictures, it was just for the joy of photography. Even so, it was hard to simply approach someone and ask to take their picture. What if they said no? What if everyone said no? The reality is that people say no all the time. I didn't hear back from a blacksmith for almost a year. I'd email him and never hear back. We even showed up at his place on Christmas Eve, and he lives a good 300 kilometers away. He still didn't agree. I followed up again and again and again. Eventually, there was a local event. He needed the photos. Guess who he called? He actively cleared his schedule to get me there. There was a death in his family on the day that we were to go over. He called. He apologized. He even set up a future date. With this new hobby of mine, photography, I've had a no from many people. Air New Zealand said no. The zoo said no. The fish and chips place in Russell, they said no. The car valet, who knows me very well, said no. I keep staying in front of their faces and asking yet again, will things change? In some cases, they never do. But in quite a few scenarios, things change. You go from being D, E, F, J, whatever you are, and then straight to the top where you are number one, you are the first choice. But you have to stay front and center. When they're ready for you, they need to be able to find you. That's when you get called, and that's when you get work. In the 1960s, Avis was definitely the better company. They were the ones that came up with all the innovations, and according to their book, Hertz just copied all the innovations. But Hertz was still number one. But Avis needed to stay in front of its customers. And in a strange way, it needed to acknowledge that it was number two. You can do that too. You don't have to go in there as number one. You don't have to be the first choice. You can go up to the client and tell them, I am the backup. I'm the person that you need when your first choice has gone on holiday, when your first choice is too ill, when your first choice is doing something else, or you just want a different style. I am number 2. You don't have to invent a whole new strategy. You can take Avis's strategy from 1962, even create ads, even create a little leaflet, even create emails, a newsletter, whatever, and call yourself the backup. And then watch how things turn. How things turn in your favor. It's one thing to think, why would they choose me? It's quite another thing to position yourself as the backup, as a different style, as someone who's available when everybody else has gone on holiday or is tending to their kids or buffaloes, whatever. But you've got to show up and you've got to keep in touch. Otherwise, nothing happens. That's why we show up week after week on this podcast. That's why we show up week after week in the newsletter if you've subscribed to the Psychotactics newsletter. We started that Psychotactics newsletter in the year 2000, and now we're in 2022. We started the podcast in 2014, around this time of the year, and now it's 2022. If you don't show up, people don't remember you. And if they don't remember you, they don't call you. They choose you because you're there. Most of the time, just because you're there. And I hope this podcast kind of underlines that for you. That brings us to the end of this podcast, and let's find out what's happening in Psychotactics land. One of the things that really helps a business is to have some kind of information product. Without the brain audit, I think our job would have been much harder. We would have been some kind of consultant in marketing. But just having that brain audit, it gave us what we'd call like a Bible. It gave us documentation, and it gave the client terminology and a system. And really, that's what an information product does. It doesn't just give you information. It gives you that system. Now, putting that information product together is where people stumble quite a lot, because they're used to books, which is chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and there's just all this volume of information, which becomes even more frustrating, especially in today's world where you already have YouTube and everything else that you're looking at and reading. And what we seek is less. What we seek is a system. What we seek is a step-by-step methodology that we can follow. And that's what the Info Product course teaches you. Why do people come back and do Psychotactics courses? Why do they keep buying home study courses? There's so much choice out there. We're not option A. We are not the well-known person out there. We're not on social media. We don't do any advertising. We're well below the radar. Why do people keep coming back? And there's a very simple reason. It is because they end up with a skill, not more information. And the reason why they get to that point is because of how we've constructed our information products. So this course, the Information Products course, shows you how to go about it, how to structure it, how to put it together. If you want to just dip your toes into it, go to psychotactics.com/info goodies, and you'll get a whole bunch of goodies. And from there on, in January, when the Info Products course is released, we will have 25 copies. If you're on the list, you get it. If you're not, you still get the goodies. And that's pretty much it. We're coming to the end of this podcast. We're coming to the end of the year. I'll say bye for now. Bye-bye. Still listening? You know that client I told you about, the design company? Well, they hired me to draw cartoons. And so that's what I did. I'd draw the cartoons. I'd send it to them on a CD because these were the dark ages. So you'd send it on a CD or on some kind of disc. And one time they needed to be at my place. They needed to either supervise what I was doing, or there was some kind of condition why they had to be at my place. And they came over, and I'd been using Photoshop because that's what I used back then. And they noticed that there were no toolbars on Photoshop, that I was operating just on shortcuts. And they didn't know how I was doing it. How was I getting the brush? How was I changing the brush size? How was I getting the opacity to 20%, 70%? They were completely confused, but mostly amazed. They just got their daughter a new computer, and they wanted her to learn Photoshop. So there were all these courses and books as option A, option B. And guess who they chose? The person that was in front of them. They looked at what I was doing. They thought, wow, this is amazing. Can you teach our daughter how to use Photoshop? I said, yes. I went for a week. I charged $1,000 for about 4 or 5 sessions. And I showed her what was crucial and how to operate without the toolbar. By the next week or the following week, she was showing other graphic designers in the company who had been around for quite a while how to use Photoshop. But that was it. It was fluke. But I went from option, I don't know, non-existent to option A. And that's how life happens for most of us, whether it's a restaurant or a musician or anything. One day you don't exist, next day you're there, but you have to be there in the first place. That's why we're here on this podcast, and that's why you're listening to us. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in 5000 BC. Bye-bye.